January 15th, 1947. A mother was walking with her young daughter through a quiet residential neighborhood in Los Angeles. It was a normal morning, until she noticed something strange lying in a vacant lot. At first, she thought it was a mannequin, but as she stepped closer, she realized that it was a woman's body, severed in half, carefully posed, and completely drained of blood. The victim would soon be identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, but the public wouldn't remember her by that name. Instead, she would become known as the Black Dahlia, one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history that has inspired countless books, movies, and documentaries. And nearly 80 years later, we still don't know who killed her. So today, we're going to discuss the details and go through the prominent suspects, and hopefully by the end of this case, you'll be able to come to your own conclusion about who you think killed Elizabeth Short. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Matcha Murder. If you're new here, hi, my name is Shay and I'm your host. Now before we get into it, I do want to take a moment to just add a quick disclaimer. This episode is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm going to discuss is publicly made information that I've found online and have compiled into this episode. I aim to discuss true crime cases with respect for the victims, their families, and those affected. This episode will cover sensitive topics, including but not limited to graphic description of the crime scene, murder, and disturbing events. If any of those topics are triggering to you, please skip this episode and I'll see you in the next one. Today, we're talking about Elizabeth Short, the woman the world would come to know as the Black Dahlia. One of the reasons the Black Dahlia case continues to fascinate people nearly 80 years later is because there are so many suspects, and yet no one has ever officially been charged. Over the decades, investigators, journalists, historians, and even family members of suspects have tried to piece together who could have killed Elizabeth Short. Some suspects have stronger evidence than others, and some theories are honestly more speculation than fact. And today, we're going to take a closer look at the suspects most commonly connected to this case, what evidence exists, and why none of them were ever definitively linked to Elizabeth's murder. So grab your matcha, because today we are diving into one of the most haunting and widely debated true crime cases of all time. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29th, 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, to Phoebe and Cleo Alvin Short Jr. She was the third of 5 daughters, with Virginia and Dorothea being the oldest, and Eleanora and Muriel the youngest. But Elizabeth's childhood was far from stable. Her father, Cleo, had invested all of his money into a miniature golf course business during the recreational boom of the 1920s. And for a while, it seemed like things were going well. Until 1929 hit, when the stock market crashed and wiped out businesses across the country, including Cleo's. In 1930, after losing everything, Cleo just disappeared. His car was later found abandoned on the Charleston Bridge, the door left open and the keys still inside. Authorities believed he had jumped, but Phoebe, not wanting her daughters to carry that trauma, told them that instead their father had drowned. The family even held a memorial service for him. That left Phoebe raising 5 young girls completely on her own. She worked as a bookkeeper to support the family and kept things afloat, which couldn't have been easy during that time. Elizabeth also dealt with serious health struggles as a child. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis, and at just 15 years old, she underwent lung surgery. Afterward, the doctors recommended she spend winters in a milder climate to help her breathing. So for the next several years, her mother sent her to Miami, Florida, where she stayed with family and friends during the winter months. Elizabeth attended Medford High School, but she eventually dropped out during her sophomore year. Despite the instability and health struggles she faced growing up, people who knew Elizabeth described her as charming, outgoing, and completely captivated by Hollywood glamour. She loved movies, fashion, and dreamt of becoming an actress. She had striking dark hair, very pale skin, and a style that made her stand out in a crowd. But like many young women chasing big dreams during that time, Elizabeth would quickly learn that fame and the life she imagined wouldn't come easily. In 1942, when Elizabeth was 18 years old, something unexpected happened. Her mother, Phoebe, received a letter from Elizabeth's father, the same man they believed was dead. In the letter, Cleo apologized and explained that he started a new life in Northern California. And I couldn't imagine receiving a letter like that from my husband, who I thought was dead, realizing that he had just abandoned me and left me to raise 5 young girls all by myself. Like, hey, Sorry, I just really didn't feel like dealing with it, so I skipped out and went to another state. What? What? Anyways, later that year in December, Elizabeth made the decision to travel to Vallejo, California to live with her father, someone she hadn't seen since she was just 6 years old. You can only imagine how emotional and complicated that reunion must have been. Unfortunately, it did not last long. Elizabeth and her father reportedly argued frequently, and by January 1943, Elizabeth moved out. After leaving her father's home, Elizabeth relocated to Lompoc, California, where she found work at the base exchange at Camp Cook. During this time, she briefly lived with a United States Air Force sergeant who was later reported to have been abusive towards her. Eventually, Elizabeth left that situation and moved to Santa Barbara later in 1943. But life continued to be unstable. On September 23rd, Elizabeth was arrested for underage drinking at a local bar, and instead of serving time, juvenile probation authorities sent her back to Boston. However, she didn't stay there long. She eventually traveled to Florida, where she met Army Air Force officer Major Matthew Gordon Jr., who was training for deployment during World War II. Elizabeth reportedly told friends that while Matthew was recovering from injuries after surviving a plane crash in India, he wrote to her proposing marriage. She accepted, but in a heartbreaking twist, Matthew died in a second plane crash on August 10th, 1945, just days before the war's end and before they were ever able to build a life together. By July of 1946, Elizabeth once again moved back to California, this time settling in Los Angeles, and over the next several months she moved frequently, staying in different locations across the city. For a short time, she rented a room in Hollywood behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub and worked as a waitress. Like so many young people at the time, Elizabeth was drawn to Los Angeles by the promise of opportunity and excitement. But Hollywood turned out to be far less glamorous than she imagined, and she was simply just a young woman trying to find her place in the world. Without a stable job or home, Elizabeth often stayed with friends, boyfriends, or acquaintances. And unfortunately, once the frenzy ensued upon her death, media coverage portrayed her as mysterious and promiscuous, something historians have since pointed out as being exaggerated or completely untrue. Then, in December of 1946, just weeks before her murder, Elizabeth suddenly left Los Angeles and traveled to San Diego. According to people close to her, she told friends that she was scared, but she never fully explained why. She just knew she needed to leave, and she left quickly. When Elizabeth arrived in San Diego, she met another young woman named Dorothy French. Dorothy and her family welcomed Elizabeth into their home and allowed her to stay with them for a short time. While she was there, Elizabeth confided in Dorothy and admitted she was hiding from an ex-boyfriend and was genuinely afraid of him. Then things took an even more unsettling turn. A few weeks into Elizabeth staying with the French family, 2 men and a woman showed up at the house asking for her. When Dorothy told Elizabeth about the visitors, she reportedly became extremely frightened and panicked. She refused to see them. Eventually, the group left, but the encounter clearly shook her. Shortly after, Elizabeth decided she needed to leave again. On January 8th, Elizabeth left San Diego with a married traveling salesman she had been seeing, 25-year-old Robert Red Manley. The two drove back to Los Angeles together, and he later dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel. Elizabeth had told him she was planning to meet her sister there, but her sister Virginia later told investigators that they had never made any plans to meet. Witnesses later reported seeing her sitting in the lobby and possibly meeting with a man. That man has never been definitively identified, and around 10 p.m. Elizabeth left the hotel, and that was the last confirmed time she was ever seen alive. After that day, Elizabeth disappeared. Friends assumed she had simply moved on or was staying somewhere else, but 6 days passed without anyone hearing from her. 6 days after her disappearance on January 15, 1947 at 10 a.m., Elizabeth's body was discovered in a vacant lot between 39th Street and Coliseum Street in Leimert Park by 27-year-old Betty Bersinger. Betty was walking with her 3-year-old daughter Anne just a few blocks from her home to the commercial district to pick up her husband's work boots that were getting repaired. At first, when Betty saw the body, she thought it was a mannequin due to the contorted position of her limbs, but upon getting closer, she realized it was something much more horrific, a human body. And this is where the case becomes extremely disturbing. Elizabeth's body was naked and had been completely severed at the waist. Her internal organs were removed and placed under her buttocks. Her body was completely drained of blood. She had several cuts on her thighs and breasts, and her body had been cleaned using gasoline, indicating she was killed somewhere else and that she was deliberately posed in the vacant lot with her arms above her head and her legs in a V-like formation. Her lower half was a foot away from her upper half. She had severe face mutilation that investigators described as a Glasgow smile, where cuts extend from the corners of the mouth up towards the ears. Betty was rightfully terrified. She grabbed her daughter and immediately ran to the nearest house, banging on the door until they answered and let her use their phone to call the police. Newspaper photographers back then would monitor police radio frequencies, and more times than not, they would actually arrive on scene before the police. And that's exactly what happened with this case. A reporter named Aggie Underwood from the Los Angeles Herald-Express was one of the first on the scene and took several photos of Elizabeth's body. Found near her body, investigators located a heel print, tire tracks, and a cement bag which contained bloody water. When her body was examined shortly after discovery by medical examiners, they found that she had rope burns on her ankles and wrists, which indicated prolonged restraint. Her stomach contained fecal matter, suggesting that she was forced to ingest it, and they noticed that there was no bruising around the incision line where the body was cut in half, which indicates that the incisions were made after her death. There were no skull fractures found, but there was bruising on the front and right side of her head, with a small amount of bleeding, consistent with blows to her head. They had also realized that her body was bisected using a technique which was taught in the 1930s. And was developed for treating traumatic injuries and specific cancers, called a hemicorporectomy. In 1947, this procedure only existed in advanced surgical operations and medical textbooks. And this procedure required precision, which convinced investigators it was someone with former anatomical training. There were no obvious defense wounds that they could see on Elizabeth's body, which raised questions about whether she knew her attacker or if she was incapacitated at the time. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging from lacerations and the shock of the blows to her head and face. They determined she had been dead for about 10 hours when they found her, predicting her time of death sometime during the evening of January 14th or very early morning hours of January 15th. When police arrived at the scene, they had no idea the identity of the young woman, and with her body being so disfigured, they knew they couldn't share photos of her with the public. So they relied on fingerprints. Detective Harry Hansen used what was called sound photo equipment, which was basically like a fax system that was capable of transmitting photographs using phone lines to send a copy of her fingerprints to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. And they were able to identify her as Elizabeth Short. Luckily, her fingerprints were already on file for two reasons. One, because she worked at the Army's Camp Cook, and the other because of her previous minor arrest for underage drinking. Once she was identified, the media exploded. Newspapers quickly gave her the nickname the Black Dahlia, reportedly inspired by a popular film noir movie called The Blue Dahlia, as she often wore black and was described as a strikingly beautiful young woman with dark hair. The press became obsessed with this case, and after learning about her moving around and staying with friends so often, the media went on to portray her as loose and man-crazy, unfortunate labels that still follow her death in case coverage and pop culture. A reporter named Wayne Sutton contacted Elizabeth's mother by phone, pretending Elizabeth had won a beauty contest, and after prying as much personal information as he could from Phoebe about Elizabeth, he then broke the news to her that Elizabeth had actually in fact been murdered. And that is just such disgusting behavior. I cannot imagine the shock that Phoebe must have went through. I mean, here she is, this reporter is telling her that, oh, hey, your daughter won this beauty contest and we'd like information about her, only to then end the call with, by the way, your daughter's dead. I lied. That's completely heartless. That is completely heartless. The intense media coverage surrounding Elizabeth's murder created enormous pressure on investigators to solve the case quickly. Reporters sometimes released details that only the killer would have known, which contaminated potential evidence and made suspect interviews less reliable. And this caused dozens of people to confess to the killing of Elizabeth Short, which unfortunately is something that happens more often in high-profile cases than most people realize. Some confessions came from people struggling with mental illness and others from individuals seeking attention. And these false confessions consumed enormous amounts of investigative time and made it harder for police to follow legitimate leads. The Los Angeles Police Department launched one of the largest homicide investigations in city's history. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case, and the investigators went to the Biltmore Hotel looking for answers. But the hotel would have no record of her registration, despite Red Manley's claim he dropped her off there and other eyewitness accounts of people seeing Elizabeth in the lobby. But one chilling development occurred on January 21st when someone claiming to be Elizabeth's killer called the office of the editor of the Examiner, James Richardson, congratulating him on the newspaper's coverage and telling him he had planned to turn himself in, but not before having the police pursue him further. He also told James to expect some souvenirs of Elizabeth Shorts in the mail, and 3 days later, a very suspicious manila envelope addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers with individual words that had been cut and pasted from newspaper clippings, along with a large message on the face of the envelope which read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The contents of the envelope included Elizabeth's birth certificate, social security card, business cards, photographs, names written on pieces of paper, and an address book with Mark Hansen imprinted on the cover. And we'll get to Mark a little bit later. The envelope had been cleaned with gasoline just like Elizabeth's body, which made investigators believe this package was sent from her killer. Even though the sender of the envelope tried to clean it, police were able to lift several partial fingerprints from it, and they were sent to the FBI. However, the prints were compromised during transit, and they could not be properly analyzed. And the same day as the packet was received by the Examiner, someone reported seeing a black suede shoe and a purse on top of a garbage can in an alley only 2 miles from where Elizabeth's body was found. And the police did recover these items, but they had also been wiped clean with gasoline, which removed any fingerprints. Over the decades, police had over 150 suspects, and we are going to be discussing the most prominent ones. The first being Robert Red Manley. Red became a suspect as he was one of the last known people to see Elizabeth before her murder, when he drove her back to Los Angeles from San Diego. He dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9, 1947, and claimed he picked up Elizabeth to test his loyalty to his wife. He was later cleared after parts of his story were able to be corroborated, and he passed several polygraph tests. Our second suspect is Mark Hansen. Now, Hansen owned Florentine Gardens nightclub and was often known for helping young women who were trying to break into Hollywood. Elizabeth had reportedly stayed at Hansen's home for a short time before her death. Some investigators believed Hansen may have had romantic interest in Elizabeth that was not reciprocated. This claim had came from Elizabeth's friend Ann Toth, who had told police that Elizabeth had recently turned down advances from Mark, and she suggested to investigators that this may have been a possible motive for him. But investigators ultimately found no direct evidence linking him to her murder, and he was ultimately cleared. One of the most famous suspects is Dr. George Hodel. George Hill Hodel Jr. was a prominent Los Angeles physician and had the surgical training and the expertise for a hemicorporectomy, which could explain the precise nature of Elizabeth's injuries. And in 1949, Hodel was investigated for allegations of sexual abuse involving his own daughter. And during that investigation, police placed his home under surveillance in 1950. While monitoring the house, investigators recorded several conversations. One recording allegedly captured Hodel saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now." Now, this statement definitely sets off alarm bells, but legally, it wasn't enough to charge him with anything. Other recorded conversations included specific knowledge of the murder details that were never released to the public, where he discussed the surgical technique and the theatrical staging of the body being used to shock and terrorize. However, the recordings were never enough for charges, and Hodel was cleared as a suspect after they could not prove that George and Elizabeth had ever met. And shortly after, George Hodel moved to the Philippines, where he started a new family and stayed until 1990. He then came back to the States and lived out his final years in San Francisco until he died in 1999. Years later, Hodel's son, Steve Hodel, who actually became a detective himself, began researching his father and publicly claimed that he believed George Hodel was responsible for Elizabeth Short's murder. Steve pointed to his father's surgical experience, his connections to powerful people, photos he claimed resembled Elizabeth that were found among his father's things, and Hodel's sudden move out of the United States to the Philippines after the investigation. But many historians and investigators argue that Steve's conclusions rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. And to this day, George Hodel remains one of the most debated suspects in the entire case. Another prominent suspect was Leslie Dillon, who was a mortuary assistant and had clear knowledge about embalming and human anatomy. He also reportedly had a fascination with mutilation cases. In the early 1950s, Dillon wrote letters to the police investigators discussing theories about the Black Dahlia murder. But his letters raised red flags because they included extremely detailed descriptions of how someone might commit such a crime. Police began to wonder if Dillon wasn't just theorizing, but describing something he actually knew. He was eventually detained and questioned extensively. Leslie knew about the rope burns on her wrists and ankles, and he also explained intimate details of her murder, yet again noting the theatrical posing of Elizabeth's body with her arms above her head, her legs in the V formation, and her body being completely drained of blood. Leslie even had connections to Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner and the fellow suspect whose address book was sent to the Los Angeles Examiner. And with this knowledge, investigators believed they had enough to charge him. However, the case against Dillon fell apart due to procedural mistakes and lack of physical evidence. He was released and never formally charged. Now, more recently, another potential suspect has come to light, the Zodiac Killer. Now, Elizabeth Short was murdered in 1947, and the Zodiac murders occurred just 22 years later, starting in 1968. Alex Babber, a cold case investigator, came forward in December of 2025, believing the Black Dahlia case and the Zodiac killings were committed by the same person. The Zodiac murders primarily happened in Northern California, with one being in Vallejo, where Elizabeth did live for a brief time with her father, and she very well could have come in contact with the Zodiac at some point during this time. Babber has also claimed to have cracked the code sent by the Zodiac Killer in 1970, claiming that it states, "My name is," followed by letters and symbols, which Babber says spells out Marvin Merrill. And you might be wondering, who is Marvin Merrill? Well, according to Babber's theory, Marvin Merrill was an alias, and his real name was Marvin Margolis. Margolis was a U.S. Navy veteran and a USC medical student who had briefly lived with Elizabeth Short and was her alleged boyfriend. Cold Case Consultants of America point to his surgical training and a sketch found in his belongings after his death in 1993 as the most prominent pieces of evidence against him. The sketch in question is a drawing of a woman that he titled Elizabeth and apparently featured the word Zodiac hidden within its shading. Babber also thinks that Elizabeth was killed in a local Los Angeles motel called Zodiac. And I won't lie, Marvin Margolis in his later years has a very strong resemblance to the sketch that was released of the Zodiac Killer by police in 1969. A lot of points from this recent breakthrough line up, and he is definitely a top suspect for me. Especially when the Zodiac Killer would send in letters of his crimes and personal belongings of his victims. That same thing happened with Elizabeth's case. The killer sent in a letter and her personal belongings. So this theory is very much like the top one on my list. I do kind of agree with the link between the two, the Zodiac Killer and whoever killed Elizabeth. I think there's something there. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. And even after so many suspects who seem like potential culprits, the case still remains unsolved. Unfortunately, several factors have contributed to this. Forensic science technology in 1947 was extremely limited. Evidence handling procedures was not as advanced. Media interference overwhelmed investigators. Numerous false confessions created confusion. Key witnesses and suspects have died over time, and even modern attempts using DNA analysis have not definitively solved the case. And while I've walked you through a few suspects in the case, it's important to remember that speculation can never replace proof, and we don't have enough to find a definitive answer. The Black Dahlia case has become almost mythological over time, but at the center of every theory is a real person whose life was violently taken. Elizabeth Short deserves to be remembered not just as a mystery, not just as the Black Dahlia, but as Elizabeth Short, a young woman whose story remains unfinished. Thank you guys so much for spending time with me on today's case. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new one. New episodes drop every week on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, with the video version going live on YouTube as well. And if there are any cases you would like to hear me talk about, go ahead and leave those suggestions in the comments down below and let me know what you think of today's case. Until next time, take care of yourself and I'll see you next week. Bye, guys.